As of January 2025, the state of Louisiana will require public schools to display the Ten Commandments in every classroom. Said State Republican Governor Jeff Landry, if you want people to respect the rule of law, you've got to start from the original lawgiver, which was Moses. It seems that the state of Louisiana remembers something that the state of Israel has forgotten. Rabbi Aaron Feldman, head of Ner Yisrael Rabbinical College in Baltimore, writes, there's only one way to describe the events of October 7th, and that is that God intervened in the workings of the world and sent a message to the Jews of Israel. How do you explain how the sophisticated electronic devices designed to detect infiltration failed? How do you explain that despite the fact that Israel controlled the airspace with fighter bombers, with armed helicopters, that it had a well-trained army and tanks and armored vehicles, it failed to respond to this invasion? The only equipment available to the Arabs was motorcycles and trucks. And yet, despite of all this, Hamas forces were able to dismantle the electronic devices, amass tractors to breach the wall, and invade southern Israel with hundreds of heavily armed troops moving on motorcycles. The warnings of the surveillance posts of military activity in Gaza were not taken seriously. The Air Force was not called into action, and it took 4 hours, and in some places 8 hours, for Israeli forces to counterattack. By that time, Hamas had wreaked havoc and death on southern Israel. Israel was shaken to its core. The unimaginable had happened. The army had failed them. It also became chillingly clear that if at the same time Hezbollah had invaded from the north and the Arabs in Judea and Samaria had decided on an uprising, this would have caused devastation and loss of life on an unparalleled level. The nation suddenly felt vulnerable, weak, and without confidence in its survival. What transpired was unimaginable, and to this day no one has explained how it happened. For in truth, there is no reasonable explanation. The only explanation is that the hand of God orchestrated the failings of the army and brought devastation to the Jews of Israel. It was God speaking to his people. We have no prophets to tell us the exact words of that message. But based on the words of the Torah and other prophecies, it likely ran something like the following. For over 75 years, you have created a state on my land with an educational system, institutes for scientific research, industry, commerce, agriculture, and general prosperity, but you omitted one element from your state. You deliberately left me out of the picture. I chose the Jews at Mount Sinai to be a nation of servants and a holy people. This meant that they were to be a nation devoted to me in every aspect of their lives. For this I gave them a Torah, in which I commanded them to have tzitzis on their clothing, tefillin on their heads, mezuzahs on their doorposts. I wanted them to testify to my existence by keeping Shabbos and the holidays, to refrain from eating foods that dampen their yearning for sanctity, to refrain from slander and the evil tongue, to support the poor, to devote themselves to the study of Torah. All of this to overcome their selfish drives for lust and power and to turn them into a holy people. To ensure that they remain a holy nation, I gave them a land where they would be able to flourish in their devotion to me without the influence of the nations of the world. The Jewish nation was my hope for mankind. I created the world so that mankind would overcome evil and accept me as their sovereign. The instrument for reaching this goal would be my nation. When the proper time arrives, I will appear to them in all my glory, and all of mankind will then recognize that man was created to devote himself to my service. Because the Jewish nation is crucial to carrying out my plans for the world, I watched over them and protected them throughout the ages, saving them from the nations of the world who sought to devour them. But you decided to thwart my plans. You decided to use my land to remake Jews into a nation like the nations of the world. You wanted Jews to be just like them, to live for the fulfillment of their appetites and to make wealth and military conquest the apex of their glory. You wanted Jews to forget that they were meant to be a holy nation. I have tried repeatedly to warn you of the evil of your ways. I sent you the Yom Kippur War, the missiles of Saddam Hussein, the Intifada, the Gaza missile attacks, and other messages to show you that you cannot build a Jewish nation and leave me out. But none of these warnings were to any avail. I became mostly concerned lately when you demonstrated for 3 months against me, when generals announced their resignations, when professors signed petitions, when your wealthy donated millions for advertisements and demonstrators to block the streets. I know the demonstrations were ostensibly against judicial reform, to retain the right of the Supreme Court to override the Knesset, but I also know that for most of you, the demonstrations were aimed at my Torah, to ensure that the Supreme Court would block any intrusion of religion into your society. I was more concerned on this last Yom Kippur, when many shuls in Tel Aviv emptied out into Dizengoff Square for the Ne'ilah services, a time when the heart of whoever identifies as a Jew turns to me in devotion. Tens of your citizens broke up the services with punching, shoving, and slogan shouting, and what was most disturbing is that afterwards there was little protest against this massive desecration of worship. I began to fear that you might be lost to me forever as my nation, and I therefore decided to wake you up with a powerful shock. I wanted you to realize that hitherto you were successful in your wars and in building up my land, not because of your cleverness or your army, but because I watched over you and granted you success. I wanted you to see that when I remove my support, even for a moment, your cleverness disappears and your army falls to pieces. It was a blow of love, made on the day of Shmini Atzeret, which I set apart for celebrating with you as my nation. You are my children whom I love unlimitedly, but I had to unleash this disaster upon you to make you recognize that you have gone astray. Because I love you, I will not permit you to become a nation like all the others. Without the Jews as a nation that lives to serve God, mankind will never reach its goal, and my plan at creation will never be realized. To make sure you got the message, I spared those Jews who have remained faithful to me. I am well aware that they have many shortcomings, but they alone remain faithful to the definition of a Jew as my people, the people who received the Torah. In the path of those murderers of Hamas was the village of Tifrach, in whose yeshiva 1,000 people had gathered to celebrate Simchas Torah, and they danced with their Torah scrolls throughout the day without even being aware of the advance of the slaughtering enemy, who, despite their original plans, decided to turn away from the settlement. The Shabbat-observing kibbutzim directly in the path of the invaders were bypassed. The shul section of Ofakim was left untouched while the rest of the town was attacked. I could easily have brought you to your knees by having Hamas coordinate their attack with an invasion of Hezbollah in the north or with an uprising in the territories. Your army would not have been able to handle that, but I did not wish to destroy you, only to awaken you. Similarly, 6 months later, when Iran sent hundreds of missiles and drones to wipe you out, I did not permit a hair of your head to be harmed. All of those missiles were destroyed. You are my beloved nation. I love and care for you as a father cares for his son. But a father cannot permit his son to sink into debauchery and corruption. He's obligated to help him extricate himself from his self-destructive ways. You are my children, and the time has come to remind you that you cannot remake my nation into another nation of the world. Until you change your ways and begin to define yourselves as Jews in its true definition, you will have to fight for your own survival. You cannot defeat those who do not care about life, who do not wish to live in peace, and whose only desire is to wipe you off the face of the earth. Even if you drive them out of Gaza, they will attack you from some other quarter. The nations of the world will not come to your assistance. They want a world free of Jews. Jews make them feel guilty for living their lives devoted to lust and power. They are ashamed to say this openly, but to the extent that they are able to cloak their hatred in noble declarations of humanitarianism, they will encourage Hamas to defeat you. You must realize that they are not the enemy. The enemy is you. yourselves and your attempt to obliterate the Jewish people by abandoning the Torah and assimilating into the culture of the nations of the world. Once you realize this and return to my Torah, your enemies will return to their holes and peace will reign in my land. I have confidence in you that you will come to your senses. You are, after all, the children of my beloved Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Your ancestors stood before me at Mount Sinai and declared, Naaseh v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. False prophets led you astray with their fraudulent promises of security and an end to anti-Semitism, if only you cease observing my Torah and become like all the other nations. The time has come to reject their false prophecies and return to me. It cannot be otherwise, for you are my nation.